On the one hand, this is the single largest year-to-year cut in the federal budget, frankly, in the history of America in absolute terms. Probably for that, we all deserve medals, the entire Congress. Relative to the size of the problem, it's not even a rounding error. In that case, we probably all deserve to be tarred and feathered.
Well, the House is set to vote Wednesday on this $38.5 billion budget deal, but it's not clear how much Democratic support it's going to get. Most of the 70 votes against the short-term spending bill Friday came from liberal Democrats who think the White House gave away too much. California Congresswoman Karen Bass is an assistant minority whip and serves on the House Budget Committee. She's also one of only 9 Democratic freshmen in the House. She joins me now.
Thanks for having me on.
Congresswoman, let me read you something that Robert Reich, former Labor Secretary in the Clinton administration, said about this budget deal. The right held the U.S. government hostage, and referring to President Obama, paid most of the ransom, inviting more hostage-taking. Next is raising the debt ceiling. Did the Democrats get a bad deal here?
Well, you know what? I think that we're all going to be very interested to see where the cuts are going to come from.
You still don't know where they are? Did anybody brief you?
We know categorically where some of the cuts are coming from, but we have to see the specifics, and we'll see the specifics, this week. The vote the other day, really, I think, from the people that voted for it, a lot of the Democrats, myself included, was really a vote to say that we don't want the House to be, we don't want the government to be shut down.
Sure.
And we also wanted to end the hostage-taking, which is essentially the way the Republicans were treating the whole affair.
But correct me if I'm wrong, Republicans only control the House. Democrats still control the Senate, and the Democrats are still in charge of the White House. How is it that if you have 2/3 of the pie here, and the Republicans have 1/3 of the pie, why did they get 2/3 of the deal?
Well, I don't know that I would really characterize it that way, but it still has to pass, so that what goes through the House, it can be stopped in the Senate, but the Republicans didn't get all that they wanted. And so although I think $38 billion in cuts is high, just think about where they started. Cutting 10,000 teachers, 65,000 kids off of Head Start, gutting the EPA. So at least we're going to have clean water and clean air. I'm thankful for that. But I do think we have to look at H.R. 1, which is where the Republicans started and what they kept fighting for until the very end.
Do you believe that the entitlement programs need major reform, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security?
What I think has to happen is that we have to put everything on the table moving forward.
I hear that phrase all the time. Now, hang on. I hear that all the time. Right. Do you think, though, that it needs major reform? What does that mean?
I don't necessarily think it needs major reform. But one thing I will say before I got here, and you know that I've only been here 3 months, last year when health care reform was done, there was reform to Medicare. That was part of what the deal was. So I do think we have to look at the solvency of the programs. I don't think under any circumstances that we should do what Ryan is calling for, which is essentially turning Medicare into a voucher program and block granting Medicaid. That would be devastating to states if that were to happen.
Explain why. You were Speaker of the California House.
Yes.
If it becomes a block grant to states, because I don't think people understand what does that mean. So basically, how is a block grant different than how Medicaid works?
So what happens very specifically, if it was a block grant, let's just say it's $100, okay, that goes to the states, or $1 million. That's it. So if that had happened to California when we were in the midst of the worst recession since the Great Depression, it would have been extremely devastating.
So you'd only have a flat amount of money.
You have a flat amount.
It's not based on population.
Right.
It's not based on the amount of Medicaid patients that are being seen.
It's not based on circumstances. And so when the unemployment rate goes up, you have more people needing Medicaid. So for California, one of the things that saved us, frankly, from going off the cliff was when we had the economic stimulus and we had an increase in Medicaid funding. When unemployment goes up, can you imagine in the early 80s with the AIDS epidemic, if there had been a cap on Medicaid, that would have been devastating. People would have literally died.
Do you believe it's necessary the president has to lay out a vision on entitlement reform? Isn't that already conceding the Republicans the point that entitlements
I think you have to look at the opposite, because if the president were to come out and say, we're not going to touch, we're not even going to examine any of this, then people would say, look at the deficit down the line. He has to at least put it on the table. The chopping block is another story. And the reforms that Ryan is calling for, I think, are devastating. And the fact that he says for Medicare, he says, well, don't worry because it won't impact anybody that's 55 or over. Well, I'm glad he took care of my generation, but he threw his own generation under the bus. And he said that he wants to make sure that his kids do not have a reduced standard of living, well, that's exactly what's going to happen. So if you're under 55, when you hit 65, you know, you're going to wind up really suffering because you're not going to be able to afford your health care.
And do you believe Medicare needs to continue to being a guaranteed benefit for anybody over 65?
I believe Medicare needs to continue being a guaranteed benefit.
Are you okay with raising the age because of the fact that we're all living longer?
Well, I don't know if we should raise the age. I do think that there's some changes that need to be done, and I think the changes that were done with health care reform last year in terms of having the insurance company payments being reduced is a start. So I think it is important to examine things, but making fundamental changes or using the deficit, raising the debt ceiling, or using a budget crisis as an excuse to essentially eliminate entitlements, I don't think is appropriate.
Very quickly, I have to go. You're an assistant whip, which
yes,
means you have to deal with vote counting.
I do.
Are you going to be whipping for or against this budget deal?
Well, as a whip, I'm going to be following the minority whip, Steny Hoyer, and
so if he says we need the votes,
if he says we need the votes, I'm going to help get the votes. Absolutely, that's my job.
Congresswoman Karen Bass from California, thanks for joining.